I'm Kathryn Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect Studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your counsellor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Hi everyone, welcome to VLGA Connect. It's time for another in our Operation Sandon series. That's the report released from IBAC recently that has been the hot topic of discussion across the sector. And while the sector digests what's in that report and awaits a response from government, we thought we might delve a little deeper into the IBAC perspective today. And before I introduce our guest, I want to say hi to the CEO of the VLGA who's here for this one, Kathryn Arndt. Hello.
Hi, Chris. It's great to be here. And as you indicated, this is the second of our Operation Sandon series. We preempted that we would be catching up with the Deputy Commissioner of IBAC following the in-depth sort of discussion, analysis, contemplation we went through, was it last week now, with Tony Rannick and Steve Cooper also. So looking forward to the discussion today.
And with no further ado, let's bring in David Wolf, the Deputy Commissioner at IBAC. David, good to see you.
And you too, Chris. Hi, Kathryn, and hi, everyone.
I know you're a busy man. I'm not sure if you've seen our special report. I wonder if you have. How'd we do in distilling the essential elements of your report?
Well, I did see it actually with great interest, and I was impressed. I think you picked out the key elements of the report and started to tease out some of the issues with the recommendations that we knew that the sector would be interested in. So I think the analysis was really valuable for the sector indeed.
Excellent. That's good to hear. Well, of course, as the report's been out there for a little while, you probably wouldn't mind an opportunity to add a bit of perspective with the various commentary that's followed the release of the report. And I know Kathryn has a couple of questions. Do you want to open the batting, Kathryn?
Yeah, look, thanks for that, Chris, and welcome, David. Well, as we know, Operation Sandon was established to investigate allegations of corruption against individuals at or involved at the City of Casey. Clearly, the recommendations in the report extend beyond one council. Could you explain to the viewers the scope of the operation and why IBAC has presented recommendations that extend beyond the City of Casey to include broader planning and local government governance-related reforms?
Thanks, Kathryn, and great question. And that's been asked of us in a number of forums. So if we look at the issues that were investigated at Casey, the report sets out the broad range of conduct that we were investigating and the findings of that investigation in terms of the evidence that set out what particular councillors were doing. But a really important part of our investigations, which we undertake in everything we do, is to not just look at those individual actions, but look at the system and the process to see if there's vulnerabilities where that conduct can occur again. And the reason we do that is clearly the human condition is present in a number of people, that where the opportunity to act improperly is there, it will be taken. So we looked at a range of issues related to governance, conflicts of interest, the way the system is around planning, the way donations, lobbying affect the way decision makers operate, with a view of that those frameworks exist across councils across the entire state. So where we identified those vulnerabilities, those corruption vulnerabilities, it's important that we then address it from a statewide perspective. So not just for City of Casey, but for the entire state. And particularly with the governance rules, I think that's really important around governance rules and code of conduct. And I know under the 2020 legislation, so the new Local Government Act, that principle-based piece of legislation, well, the essence behind that was that individual councils be able to set their own frameworks around the way they operate and to a degree manage their own affairs. One of the drawbacks and one of the restrictions on that is that the state has a singular mechanism to oversight that or regulate that. So where there's not that consistency across the 79 councils, it makes it very, very difficult for regulation and almost frustrating for the communities, and they're not seeing the same sort of equitable regulation across the entire sector. So for a range of reasons, but primarily for system vulnerabilities, our recommendations are statewide, and to the degree possible, we're looking for that harmonisation or consistency across the state.
David, just on that issue of the Principles-Based Local Government Act 2020, in your view, was there perhaps a risk element that wasn't fully factored in moving the legislation in that direction and away from more prescription?
So I think the legislative life cycle is generally start off with enabling principles-based legislation, and then over time it becomes more prescriptive as you find flaws or issues that need to be tidied up and codified through legislative remit. So that's the life cycle legislation. There were perhaps opportunities in the Act to identify that, and I often hear, particularly around codes of conduct and governance rules from the sector, is, okay, we understand, you can enable us to make our own, our own sort of playground here, but can you just tell us how to do it? And I've heard that so many times.
Yeah.
But for a singular state regulatory system, there ought to be consistency across the state, particularly those areas.
David, concerns have been raised by elected representatives, the councillors and some community members that should planning reforms be implemented that take away council's current planning responsibilities, local democracy will be undermined and community voices in planning decisions will no longer be heard. How do you respond to these concerns?
Firstly, by drawing from the report. I know it's 308 pages long, but there's some really illuminating elements to the report. And the first is that under the local democracy at Casey, the decision-making was undermined by those elected representatives. So that's the start point. In the course of the investigation, there was a couple of points raised by councillors from the City of Casey at the time. And the first was that the complexity and the capability around planning matters just simply didn't exist within the group of councillors. And secondly, the enormous amount of time that was spent on complex planning matters where the capability didn't exist was detracting from the broader role of the Office of Councillor. And then, of course, you've got the conduct issue wound in. So that was a set of circumstances at Casey. It would be reasonable to say that that's reflected across the state in many, many councils. So going to the recommendations around how to structure planning decision-making, I would say it's not a diminution of the role of the Office of Councillor. It's really, what do we want councillors to focus on? What are the councillors' strengths and what does the community want councillors to focus on? And around being that voice, that community voice in the setting of a local planning scheme. So what are the rules around the planning scheme that will be overlaid across the community and making sure the community's expectation and voice is reflected in that, rather than spending time then in the business making decisions on those matters. So the recommendations framed around getting greater consistency and better decisions, so consistent legal decisions under a planning framework, and also allowing councillors then to really fulfil their role in that community advocacy role around things like setting the scheme, but many other facets of the councillor role that we see as really important.
David, it sounds like you see a way for this new system to be put in place that doesn't lose that local input. Is that, in your research, how it's been experienced in other states? I think New South Wales is an example you point to in the report a few times.
So firstly, talking about the model that is recommended, those matters that sit below a threshold are still dealt with at council level, but albeit by the planning professionals who have the expertise to deal with them and apply a legal framework, because it is effectively admin law. You've got a legal framework and you've got an application, you've got to apply that and make a reasoned decision. So your planning professionals have the skill set to do that. And then above that threshold, so it might be size, scale, impact of the development application or the precinct structure plan or whatever the case may be. But where it goes above that threshold, our recommendation is that there are independent planning panels, a determinative panel to make that decision. Now, the makeup of that panel is really important. And that's something that we've asked. One of the key recommendations out of Operation Sandon, I should have started with this, is that we've asked the state to create a task force which has representatives from all the policy areas of government and experts across government to inform how these recommendations can be best implemented. So one of those decisions will be, well, where's that threshold set? So where's the bar set in terms of those decisions? But also a key decision would be around what's the construct of those panels, how will they operate, where's the expertise drawn from? Now, will council have a seat at that table on a panel? I don't know the answer to that. Would they have a voice in terms of informing that panel? Then absolutely, and that's the model that exists in New South Wales, where they have a voice in terms of providing advice about what the community's expectations are around that development application or planning application.
David, the VLGA were very pleased to see that recommendation about the establishment of a task force. And I do note also in the report that IBAC's requested a report back to IBAC, I think, within 18 months of the tabling. I guess that does raise questions, though, given that there will be the next local government election that falls within that 18-month period. Do you have any sense, I mean, how quickly can this task force sort of get up and running, and what will candidates need to understand about their responsibilities, well in advance of that local government election? And I mean, it'll be really important that they understand what their responsibilities will be, particularly as they relate to planning. And you talked a little bit about how the experiences of Casey, where, councillors were spending an incredible amount of time on planning matters.
I guess, Kathryn, that's one of the key frustrations. As most people know, Operation Sandon has been tied up in litigation for almost 2 years. So the recommendations that you see in the report, we've been talking and having some consultation with the policy areas. It was 2 years ago, with a view of, we could see the 2024 elections in sight and thought hopefully we'd get some reforms by then, but that's not going to be the case. It's very unlikely there'll be any legislative reform before 2024. We'd hope that's the case, but I think just practicalities would say that that's not going to be the case. So to your point, those nominating for the 2024 elections, I think it's really important to have a understanding that there may well be change. Now, what that change looks like between now and then, hopefully there's some sort of guidance that the task force is implemented in place and start giving some guidance as to what it might look like. But it's really important for councillors to, or candidates to acknowledge that there will be change in that term, most likely. What does it mean for the role of Office of Councillor? I hope it does still mean that there is that really important community engagement role. So one, engaging and consulting with the community, and then being able to express that broader municipality voice around what the local communities want, and really govern the entire community. But also a renewed focus on council governance itself. So the way the councillor group operate, having a really defined role in terms of responsibilities and what's their role in terms of governance for the organisation. So I think they're some really good things to focus on for potential candidates.
And just on that, David, there has been, of course, as I mentioned earlier, concerns raised, significant concerns raised about the potential changes to planning decision making. But on the flip side of that, and I think consistent with what you've just said, there has also been a few comments made by people in the sector on that very point, suggesting that perhaps these changes, should they progress, might actually make the role of a councillor, I won't say easier, because it isn't easy being an elected representative, but allow them to come out of those very complex, quite administrative matters that you described, and focus more on the representation of their community.
Look, I couldn't agree with you more. I still recall a friend of mine who was on council, a rather large metro council, and I remember walking into their place and seeing these enormous folders of information on their lounge room table, and it was like extraordinary. And I remember saying to her, like, what's all that? And she said she was on the planning subcommittee, didn't come from a planning background, and was reading this enormous amount of material, which was taking hours and hours and hours. And she lamented that it was drawing away from all the other business and work of council. So for me, there is a real opportunity for a reprioritisation of time of really important councillor time onto the strategic side of being a councillor and the strategic side of governing for an entire municipality, as opposed to being locked into those operational decisions.
David, you mentioned the council governance issue there before, and about half, if I remember correctly, of the 34 recommendations relate more to those governance issues. I think everyone was expecting there to be recommendations about conflicts of interest management, etc. There's a few in there that perhaps people weren't expecting, like how council meetings are run, who speaks for and against items, and the way they vote, etc. How do you respond to those people who said it's going a little bit further than they thought it would or even should?
The first thing I would say is it's been really heartening to hear how many councils already have implemented a large degree of those recommendations. So in the absence of any prescription under legislation, they're doing it anyway, which is great. So it says that we're working on the same sort of lines. Clearly, the reasons for the recommendations are drawn out of the evidence. It's where the system was effectively gamed by a number of councillors to further the cause of a person who was supporting them financially. The recommendations, as I said, are sound in terms of, to the extent possible, minimising that opportunity again. Some of the recommendations still have a bit of a planning flavour, if planning was still to be part of councillor roles. Now, if that's if the recommendations in relation to planning are implemented, then they're not as critical. But I still say that there's decisions that council will be making around, community or council, community assets, either the sale or purchase or even the use of a council asset, decisions around grants, decision around some of the operational functions. I think the same governance overlay ought still apply to make sure that any conflicts are properly declared. The reason for that conflict is declared, rather than just noting a conflict and leaving. What's the actual reason for it? And the one that I'm really wedded to is having a consequence if you declare a conflict of interest, yet still try and influence another councillor to vote in a particular way. I think that was a real standout for me. And whilst people accept that it's not right, there was no consequence if it was contravened.
David, just on that, you would be aware that there was a review into the culture of local government a year or two back now. Did IBAC, I guess, apply the lens of that culture review when thinking about some of these recommendations?
Indeed. So our work was framed prior to that being done, and of course we had the opportunity to read it and review what we'd spoken about. The culture review had some really informative parts to it. The key issue for us was around the system to manage councillor misconduct, conduct issues from a really low level up to that threshold of where there's a sanction that ought to be applied. And in my time in local government, I've seen 4 different iterations of a conduct model, and I'm sure any of them have been that effective. There's work to be done in that space, and that's hence our recommendation around more work to be done, how to come up with a much better model. There's some takeaways from other jurisdictions where it's done better, but I think there's an opportunity for Victoria to take the lead and have a really responsive and effective system that deals quickly, swiftly with misconduct issues to hopefully resolve them. We all acknowledge that one of the biggest detrimental consequences of a discipline system is the time it takes to actually come up with an outcome and a consequence. And
there is, as you would be aware also, the local government inspectorate is about to undertake a review of the current councillor conduct framework, which I think will be well received, the review that is, by most in the sector, for those very reasons of the time that it does take, and also not a lot of clarity around what the consequences are when misconduct is found to have occurred. It has been said to me that perhaps we should model something like the football tribunals. They're certainly swift, but perhaps that's something for the review to consider and not for me to make comment on. Yeah, look, I think that work is incredibly important. The timing, again, is really important. The LGI have a role to play with the task force and informing the task force on what
what's best practice, what's the issues with current systems, and what's best practice around Australian jurisdiction. So timing in terms of our recommendations and that piece of work is really fortuitous.
It's a really good point you make there, David. And I do wonder if you had any reflections on the state government's awareness or recognition of the resourcing and support that that local government Victoria and also the inspectorate might require in order to progress or inform any of these or inform the task force in a meaningful way about these recommendations.
We are fully aware that each time a recommendation is made, there's generally a cost attributed to that if it was fully implemented. So again, that there are issues for the task force to grapple with around what is the best outcome, and that also includes what the cost might be for the implementation of the recommendations. And again, I think having the representatives around the table from the various sectors, including the LGI and the local government sector, I think it's really important in determining that.
A couple from me, David, if you don't mind. On the conflict of interest recommendations, I just want to play a bit of devil's advocate here. There's been a view for quite some time that every time an attempt's been made to clear up or simplify or make that conflict of interest framework work more effectively, that it hasn't been successful. What's your view on how to make sure that these changes actually make the system easy to follow and more effective rather than complicate an already complex issue?
So coming from the previous Local Government Act and what was seen to be quite a complex system of conflict of interest regulatory framework, where in fact it was, once you worked your way through it, it was relatively easy then to overlay the set of circumstances to a more principle-based. I'm not sure has made it any easier. I think one of the biggest issues, Chris, around conflicts of interest is most of it relates to planning decisions. The bulk of them relate to planning decisions. So if the first recommendation around planning is accepted and adopted, then that's going to negate a lot of the conflict of interest issues. The recommendations that we make at a high level are around transparency. So ensuring that, well, firstly, understanding. So there's some training requirements that we're recommending, some capability uplift in terms of understanding what a conflict is and how to declare it, and then transparency when they are declared. And I think that's a really important one. As I said before, and I alluded to that at the moment, the possibility is there to declare there is a conflict, but not detail what it is and then have no involvement. And I don't think that's acceptable for the community. You need to have an understanding of what it relates to understand how it might affect the decision making.
I guess the elephant in the room here is that the 34 recommendations are just that, recommendations. You probably can't give us much of an answer to this question, but do you have any insight into how the government might respond to these recommendations and in what time frame?
So firstly, as alluded to before, our report sets a report back time frame of 18 months, which gives sufficient time for the task force, if adopted, to be developed and have some really sound understanding about how the recommendations might be implemented. You're right, they are a matter of government to accept and then draw upon. I have heard that some people in the sector have said that there might be some focus on some recommendations and perhaps not so on others. We're not hearing that at all. And in fact, our consultation with the policy areas over the last 2 years has been really quite positive. And we understand that some of the shaping of the response is well underway. My expectation is certainly the task force will be implemented, and I would expect the 34 recommendations will see some really good results.
So you also mentioned, perhaps one last question from me, David, the 2-year delay because of litigation, etc. I noticed that I think it was the MOV, when they responded, described it as a relief for the sector to see the report out there. I can only imagine the relief within IBAC. Can you talk a bit about how frustrating that time period must have been?
Yeah, it is for a range of reasons, because we think the recommendations are really sound. There's an enormous amount of work gone into those recommendations, and we think they are really going to improve the operations of not just local government, but also state government. And I think that I've heard the term used a couple of times. It's sort of like it's a crossroads moment for local government. It's a pivotal time. The change in local government, the last big change was 1989, 90, early 90s. And I think we all remember that fondly, or not so. The 2020 Act, an important piece of legislation, but when I speak to people in the sector, I ask them, has it made a real difference? And most people say not really. It's been a lot of work for the administration, but in terms of the way things actually are done, no real change. I think this really does represent an opportunity for some really good change. And if it does result in refocusing the role of Office of Councillor onto that strategic and great decision making for the entire community, for the future of the municipality, then that's got to be a good thing. Yes, in terms of the 2 years, I would acknowledge that there has been some frustrations, noting that under our system, people have a right to exercise their legal remedies if they see fit. We recognise that, but of course, that does frustrate when you've got a body of work like this that we simply haven't been able to talk about for 2 years. That does pose challenges for us.
Look, there are many other recommendations in there that we could go into detail about, but I think this has been a very useful first discussion. The next steps from here, from the VLGA's perspective, is that we will be holding a sort of a member briefing where we unpack each of the 34 recommendations. But David, we would love to have you back again in the future if we need to delve into any of those recommendations in more detail. But certainly it's been a great opportunity to hear from you today and understand a little bit more about the scope of the report and the intent of the recommendations. So thank you.
My pleasure. Great to see you again.
Thank you very much, David Wolf, Deputy Commissioner at IBAC, and of course, Kathryn Arndt, CEO at VLGA, for this special Operation Sandon edition of VLGA Connect. Stay tuned for more coming very soon.